All right, class, welcome to Unit 10. Y'all are almost to that finish line. And while this Unit 10 discussion is probably the most unstructured of the entire course, I still wanted to make a short video just to give you a little bit of guidance, although, it's basically going to be up to you to pick an article and follow the guidelines here in the discussion and get your review of your article written up. But I thought it would be good just to give you a few little tips on how to make it an easier process for you. So what you're really doing is taking all the different hypothesis tests that you've learned in here over the weeks of the course. And hopefully now that you've learned a lot of different types, and many of them are mentioned here in the discussion directions, we've looked at different types of t-tests to compare means. We've looked at ANOVA and primarily just one-way ANOVA, which is also a way to compare means when you have three or more groups. We've looked at correlation, where we looked at the association between quantitative variables or even variables that have a way of being quantified. Regression, where we looked at building linear models, and chi-squared test of independence. So you've got a lot of different types of tests in your toolbox just after getting through the first, the 9 weeks of the course that you've already gotten through. Now, at the same time, though, there are many different types of statistical tests that exist. We barely scratched the surface, and I know that that's hard for y'all to believe after getting through these 9 weeks. But what that means is when you go to try to find an article, you may find articles that the studies used a lot of statistical tests that you don't recognize the names for. Chi-squared was the only non-parametric test that we covered in here, but there are plenty of others that you may not even recognize the names of them unless you by chance had them in some other statistics course, and probably only at the graduate level would you get into some of those. But point being is you're going to really want to scan the article and make sure that it's an article that seems fairly easy for you to understand. Don't expect for you to understand everything that you read in the article. That would be unrealistic, because it's bound to have some technical jargon that might not be completely familiar. But by scanning through some articles, first, don't force yourself to pick the first one you get to. By giving yourself plenty of time to scan through a bunch of articles, you ought to be able to hopefully find one that's a fairly easy topic that you already have a pretty good understanding of, and that happens to include tests that are familiar to you from the course. So that's the first thing, is don't expect to understand everything, but do make sure you at least spend some time reviewing different articles where you can find an article that seems easier for you to manage and not such a struggle. In other words, I don't want you to read the article and feel like I have no idea what I'm reading, but I'm just going to try to get this assignment done. It's going to be a lot more meaningful to you and even easier to do. And will allow you to do a much better job if you spend some preliminary time reviewing different articles and trying to find a good one. So do not expect to find it right off the bat. So right here on the left side of the screen, I'm going to go into the PG online library. And of course, that's through my studies. And, just some tips. Y'all, you've probably had to write many other papers in your program. You're probably more well-versed in doing this kind of stuff through the PG library than I can even begin to show you. But just a few things. I would probably go into, let me maximize this for just a second. All right. So, you want to reduce it down to just looking at peer-reviewed articles. So, something you can do right off the bat if you have no idea like what journal to use, or, you're just literally going from scratch, then you definitely might want to maybe start over here by going to searching just articles, because you don't want to search books or, news or anything like that. You want research articles from research journals. And so I'm going to click on articles over here. One of these top two, Academic Search Complete and ProQuest, are the more common ones. So I'm going to click on ProQuest. And like I already was kind of playing around with it before I started the video, but I mean, you're going to have something blank right here. It's going to say enter search terms. So, my first suggestion here is make it something that is interesting to you and that you feel like you have a little bit of knowledge about. So typically my MM570 students, a lot of them are very interested in things like autism and PTSD, substance abuse. I mean, different things like this. So, I just kind of played around with it, put in autism, cognitive behavioral therapy. And then you might even want to add the name of a type of a test that you're hoping to find used in your article. I mean, you don't have to do that, and it will still bring up stuff, but it might help to narrow the search. So I might just put in like ANOVA, something like that. And then go ahead and click search over here. Oh yeah, let's actually go back. Let me go back and check off peer reviewed as well. So check off full text, check off peer reviewed. The peer reviewed specification is stated in your discussion directions. So click search. And you can start just scanning different articles that look interesting to you. Now, the first thing I would say is if something doesn't even sound like a study, like for example, let me see if I see any here. I was going to see if I just saw, just something like oral research presentations or something like that. Or if it just says something like review of the literature, then that implies those are clues that it's probably not an actual study that was done. So you want to make sure that you pick an article that discusses an actual study that was done, either an observational study or an experiment that you've learned about throughout the course. So, if we go to the top up here, effects of a music therapy group intervention on enhancing social skills in children with autism, then I would probably, if that looks interesting to you, I would probably go ahead and click on full text PDF. And to just help speed up the scanning of the different articles to try to get to one that looks very manageable to you, I would certainly, if it has an abstract at first, or you can click right here on this tab, you might want to read the abstract, which is a short paragraph, to give you an idea of what it's about. Even possibly by reading the abstract, you might be able to tell whether it sounds too complex or not. But if you read it and you feel like, well, I understand what they're describing, how they conducted their study and so forth, then it might even in the abstract tell what type of hypothesis test or test, because many studies use more than one type of test. So it might mention that in here, although at a glance, I don't see that it does. It looks like it's talking about just the study itself and different group sessions, what scales were used, things like that. But if you then go in the article, so let me go back to full text PDF. If you then go in the article and keep scrolling until you get to the results section, the results section is where you typically are going to find what types of statistical tests were used. And if you start seeing different things like Mann-Whitney U-test and things that you're like, well, I never heard of that, then you probably will want to go try to find another article. All right. So I would try to get to the results, which are usually, more towards the end of the article, because all of the other questions that are mentioned in the discussion are pretty easy to find. I mean, I honestly think the hardest thing is going to be to narrow it down and find an article. Once you do that, I think you'll find the questions pretty straightforward. All right, so here we get to the results section. Children in both interventions were scheduled to meet in a group setting. I mean, I don't want to sit here and read to you, but I'm just saying scan this, read through this, and here's where it gets to outcome measures, pre-test, post-test, a 2x2 mixed ANOVA. Now, we really primarily did one-way ANOVA, so this is a little bit more of a complicated ANOVA design. But, with just even your foundation that you've gotten from the course, you probably would have enough understanding of what this is showing. You're going to have to be the gauge of that. But so far, okay, ANOVA, I think we can figure that out. Comparing pre-test, post-test scores. We've already talked about stuff like that throughout the course. With group as a between subject factor. So I would have to go read earlier and see what those different groups were. I went ahead and skipped over that. A significant effect at the P less than 0.05 level. Well, hopefully now you understand that kind of stuff. Was found for the interaction of time and group. This is the F is your test statistic right there, the 5.646. There's your p-value, 0.032, so you can tell that, yes, it's significant. This is effect size. We didn't cover that, so of course that probably doesn't make sense to you, but you're not in, the intent here is not to include every little detail from your study. Remember, I'm saying you're probably not going to recognize every single detail of the study. And then it says a paired samples t-test indicated significant differences for the music group pre-test scores and post-test scores. Well, we've talked about pre-test, post-test throughout the course when we looked at paired samples t-test. So, I think there's probably enough here when you scroll down. Here's your ANOVA table where you can see your different test statistics, F and P values right next to them and see which ones are significant. So, I feel like personally this would probably be something that you could do and be able to make some sense out of it enough to get the questions answered. Let me minimize this. So that I can bring up the screen now where you've got your questions. So find an article, and as I said, if key thing is pick something that's a topic of interest. Use words in the search bar, like I used ProQuest, but use words in there to help you narrow down topic, type of statistical test, and any details you can bring in, because that helps narrow the scope so that you're not just searching through billions and billions of articles where you're running into so many of them that are things you don't really understand. Try to use the search words to help you narrow the scope. So you'll find an article. We already found one peer reviewed. I showed you where you could check that off and give you some, tips on words you can include. Not that these are the only words you want to put, but words you can include along with your topic words to help you narrow your search. Paste a link to your article for part A of the discussion and write out the full and appropriate APA reference. That's part A, not that bad. Statement of purpose. Read the article, write a paragraph describing the research question proposed and the goal of the study. Well, that's usually either in the abstract or at the very beginning of the article. So let me click on the abstract and just see what it says. Research indicates that music therapy can improve social behaviors and joint attention in children with ASD. However, more research on the use of music therapy interventions for social skills is needed to determine the impact of group music therapy. To examine the effects of a music therapy group intervention on eye gaze, joint attention, and communication. Yeah, that didn't sound like a full sentence. But anyway, point being is right in those words are you tweak the wording and try to write it as an actual research question. Okay, or at least phrase it in terms of this was the purpose of this particular study. And you can also even look at the title, can help you. So it was looking at the possible use of music therapy interventions. Try to put it in your own words, although since you're pretty much pulling a research question straight from the study, you're going to be using a lot of the same words. I mean, definitely don't plagiarize this discussion for sure. But I mean, some of the words like just a statement of the goal are going to definitely have a lot of common wording in that part, just because you are pulling the words out and saying this was their goal. You're not saying that these are your own words. You're saying this was their goal. So, but the wording right there to get this would be right in these first paragraphs in the abstract, or like I said, usually in the first part of the article is where you could find that. Just clicking on the full text and see if we see stuff. Yep. Okay, good. So see full text. Look what I see. Objective. To examine the effects of a music therapy group intervention on and these other things. Eye gaze, joint attention, and communication in children with ASD. Bam. There it is. If you want to even put that in quotes and say, as stated from the article, here is the objective of the study, that is fine. Okay, that's part B. Part C, describe the analysis. Well, this is going to be a little bit more in-depth paragraph, but it's giving you questions to look, to guide you in this part C. How were the participants selected? What was the population of interest? Well, we can already tell that the population of interest is children with ASD. Was the study an experiment or an observational study? Well, you're going to have to read through the article and, look at how did they randomly assign the students to different groups? Did they impose a treatment, or did they just observe as conditions as they were? What variables were examined and or compared? And then determine the type of hypothesis test or test plural, because remember, you might get more than one used in the study, employed in the analysis. Do you think the type of test was appropriate? What was the reported value of the test statistics and the p-values? Were they significant? So I already showed you the results section. That's where you are going to get, for this particular article, where you would get the test statistic and the p-value. In terms of how are the participants selected, you'll usually find that. And, here's my other advice. After you've decided that this is going to be the article, certainly, read through the whole thing first. I wouldn't spend my time scanning up and down trying to answer just the questions. I would at least first read the article in its entirety, so that from start to finish, you've got a good idea of what was actually done in the study. But otherwise, to then zero in on these questions, the method section is typically where you're going to find a lot of this information. How were the participants selected? It's already describing that in this participants section right here. And then it says participants were randomized to either this group or this group. And so it's starting to sound like it was an experiment. I'm just kind of reading down. Yeah, and you would just have to read more carefully about what they did with both of the groups, but it's definitely sounding like it's an experiment. They randomly assigned the participants to the different groups, but I haven't read carefully enough to know exactly what they did with each group. Obviously, it was something to do with different type, music therapy. All right, and then the hypothesis test, we already said that it seemed to talk about pre-test post. It talked about ANOVA, and you can even specify the type of the ANOVA that it was. And then I think it also mentioned the t-test, the paired samples t-test. And for the variables, that's where you're going to go look and see what they measured. And that, that's just going to require more reading. I'm not going to sit here and answer every question, but I'm just trying to guide you as to where this information for each part of this discussion, where the answers typically are in research articles. There's a pretty standard format, and while not every article is going to follow it, step by step, it's a general area of where you find these things regardless of what type of article you pick. And then review results. Write a paragraph describing the conclusions that were given. That doesn't have to be technical. This is where, we really want your own words. So, because if you end up doing a copy paste, first of all, that's just really not your own work. And also, it would lead your instructors to believe, do you really understand what the conclusions are? It ought to be that you can read the article, start digging into the details of it, and then someone should be able to ask you, well, what conclusions did the study provide? And you ought to be able to answer it without necessarily looking at the words in the article itself. So kind of think of it that way. How would you answer somebody just quickly asking you, well, what conclusions did the study have? But definitely try to put this part in your own words. Include a critique of the article's results and whether you agree with the conclusion the authors have offered with respect to the analysis. I mean, do you feel like their results are appropriate for, the type of study that they did? Do you feel like, were there any limitations, and does that lead you to doubt the validity of these conclusions, that kind of thing? And where you find limitations and implications for further research are typically towards the very end, even after all the results and stuff. So were there any limitations to the study? I'm going to head on towards the very end after the results. Yeah, here's even more on the goal. Here's the purpose of the study, even at the end. It's just recapping everything. Okay, so I'm going to the conclusion. Let's see if we can find anything there. I don't right off the bat. Usually there's a limitation section, but this one doesn't seem to have one. Results from this study provide initial evidence that music therapy group sessions targeting social skills may improve joint attention and eye gaze. Furthermore, there are indications that the intervention improved, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So although improvements were found, more research is needed to examine intervention efficacy through a larger trial. This study provides a basis for larger studies. So I didn't really pay close attention yet to how large the sample size was, but that sounds like it might be a limitation and also at the same time implication for further research. So this one doesn't have much as far as the limitation goes. You know, they'll differ. There are some that are going to be way more specific about it, but totally depends on the article you pick. But remember, you yourself can even come up with limitations just based on you reading the article and now taking your statistical knowledge and being able to bring in your own critique. Like, for example, if you know that they use just convenience sampling and just let people volunteer for the study, well, that would, for me, be, a limitation because there's most likely bias in the participants and, specific types of bias depending on what the study was about. But, feel free to even add your own limitations. You don't necessarily have to have something that you find in the writing itself. So, but anyway, I know that's some parts of this, or I leave you hanging on some of this stuff, but that's just because it's going to all really ultimately depend on what article you pick, and that sort of thing. But I hope, if anything, that this gives you a little bit of a guide as to how to get started, rather than you just sitting there going, oh my gosh, this is so unstructured, I don't know where to begin. There's definitely places to begin. Hopefully I've given you enough guidance with that. And, you just have to dive in. And remember, the main thing up front is give yourself time to scan a bunch of articles. Don't force yourself to pick the first thing you see out there, because you'll end up probably getting something that contains all sorts of statistical tests that you don't really understand. And something with a topic way complicated. Don't make it be that way on yourself in this final week. Make it easy. Choose something that's interesting to you. And through using search tools and scanning, a variety of articles, hopefully you'll narrow it down and find something that, is not too complicated and not too hard for you to actually analyze with your critique. All right. Good luck to y'all and have a strong finish.